Hey guys, it's Matt here from Sweat Elite and welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the Faster Marathon project leading into the Chicago Marathon 2024 that's taking place in less than 4 weeks time now. In this episode, I'll be doing something a little bit different. I'll be sharing an interview that I was the interviewee on last week from an athlete that I coach that also has a YouTube channel. His name is Andrew Pozza. His channel is called The Midlife Runner, that's his pseudonym, also on Strava. I've been coaching Andrew for several months now, and the reason why I'm sharing this is because I've noticed through a lot of questions through either Instagram or Strava or the YouTube comments section that quite a lot of people don't realize that I'm a coach as well. I've been coaching for most of my adult life, almost 18 years now, and I started the Sweat Elite Coaching Academy almost 2 years ago now that's grown to have almost 150 members with quite a few coaches as well. And so quite a few people are asking me questions about coaching, about my training philosophy and so on and so forth, and I thought that sharing this conversation with Andrew is a perfect opportunity to get to know me as a coach. So it's about an hour long. Not too much about my training in the last week. You can follow my training in detail specifically over on Strava. The link is in the top of the comments section just below here. And yeah, this is a fun conversation I had with Andrew, and I thought it'd be a good way to break up the series a little bit and do something slightly different in the middle. A conversation all about the marathon, training and racing. I'd like to say a huge thank you to the sponsors that have supported my journey and specifically this marathon build, the Chicago Marathon build. That is Ketone IQ. Many of you are familiar with Ketone IQ now. Many of the world's best athletes are utilizing Ketone IQ in training and in racing, including Cole Hocker, Cooper Tier, Sarah Hall, Des Linden, so many of the world's best triathletes as well. I've been taking Ketone IQ every day, and I really like the new peach flavor with caffeine as well. Soar Running, everything that I'm wearing in training at the moment, and pretty much everything I've been wearing for the last few years in training is Soar Running. Their gear is the best. It's so durable, so lightweight, awesome for heavy sweaters such as myself, and I strongly recommend checking out Soar Running, and you can also score a 15% off discount if you hit the link in the top of the screen right now. It's also in the description as well. And also Kaizen. Andrew, who interviews me in this episode, is also a Kaizen fan as well. We talk a little bit about that in this episode, and I highly recommend checking out Kaizen to see what marathon prediction it has for you. Mine's currently sitting at about 2:15, which is probably a little bit faster than what I would predict myself to run, but huge thanks to Kaizen for the confidence, and I've been really enjoying working with the guys over at Kaizen, and I strongly recommend checking out the application yourself. You just connect your Strava. It's very straightforward, and it will give you a marathon prediction, and it will set you some goals as well. So yeah, thank you to the sponsors that have supported Sweat Elite and my build to the Chicago Marathon, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Andrew Pozza from the Sweat Elite Coaching Academy that's also shared over on his YouTube channel as well. One mistake I see a lot of Americans make is they'll book to Berlin Marathon or to Tokyo Marathon, and they'll fly in on like the Friday night with a Sunday morning race, and I'm like, oh man, that's close. Like that's really hard to get your time because a time difference of 6 hours plus, it really does require a few days to adjust, probably closer to 4 or 5 days.
Now, I know in previous marathon attempts, you've run 220, 221, 222, and were on pace in some of those and experienced some cramping. Do you have any anxiety around that?
I don't. I really don't. Because I line up, I'm pretty optimistic in general, and when I line up in races, I do not worry about the cramping. I just don't. So African runners, more specifically Kenyan runners, are very good for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons why they're good is they have this, they don't often use GPS very well, and they're not super familiar with it. They're more inclined to, join a group of people and just run with them. They're very, very good at going, okay, my marathon pace is this, 3 minutes per kilometer or 4:50 per mile, which is some of the best ones, obviously. And when they hit a hill, they're very good at intuitively knowing what the same effort is by going up the hill. And so they won't even look at their watch and go, oh, up the hill I need to do 3:10 per kilometer. To them, it's like, the pace doesn't matter. It's just like, keep the effort there. Like they're very good at intuitively knowing what that effort is. How
much did Floberg pay you to pace him at the Boston Marathon? And can you work with my budget?
He didn't pay me anything. I don't think I would ever take money from someone to pace, honestly. I love pacing people. I really find it meaningful to help people run a good time.
So that, what you just watched, is what they call a hook. And this is called an introduction. Hi, my name is Andrew, and I sat down with my coach. His name is Matt Fox. You may recognize him. He's got a YouTube channel called Sweat Elite. We sat down and we talked everything marathon training So if you're training for a fall marathon, hopefully you get some benefit out of it. We also talked about a second thing. We talked about his prep for the Chicago Marathon. The last thing we talked about was my prep for the Marine Corps Marathon. Oh, also, this is the part where I tell you I took all of the content and I chopped it up into little pieces and I call those chapters. Okay, so you can just navigate. You can go wherever you want. You're free to roam. It's a free country. You just go wherever you want, find the question you want to listen to and listen to it. Also, this is the part where I hard sell you on subscribing to the channel. Please subscribe. That's it, the end. And also enjoy this conversation with Matt Fox.
All right, so I've broken this conversation down into 3 topics that I want to talk about. The first one is marathon training. How Matt's marathon training is going is the second topic. And then lastly, we can look at how my training is going for the Marine Corps Marathon. For those who don't know, I am part of the Sweat Elite Coaching Academy. Matt Fox is my coach, so this is also going to be a little bit of a coach's corner. But before we get into any of that, you fly across the world and you record pro runners doing workouts. You talk with their coaches, right? And so this has to be a gold mine of information for you. What are some things that you've learned?
I've learned a lot, but I feel like basically all of the answers I would give, people have probably heard before in different books or podcasts or YouTube, channels. Would you like me to answer it in the context of the marathon? Or because it's obviously quite different across the board with middle distances as well. But given that we want to, well, you've already sort of made it clear that the first third of this would be about the marathon. So I will speak about the marathon. I think the main things that I've learned from the athletes and coaches that I've been able to do content with, I think the first one is there's really no getting around doing a good marathon without doing a lot of work at threshold. And when I was a middle distance runner, so very short background, I was a middle distance runner between the ages of 19 and 26. I tried to qualify for 2 Olympic Games and sort of missed out on both occasions. Threshold for the middle distance events is not critical. A lot of athletes go very far in the 800 meters especially without doing a lot of threshold work. But in the marathon, I don't think there's any way of getting around it without doing basically a threshold session at least once a week. And that ideally would be starting at around 5K worth of volume in total, or 3 miles of volume, and then really trying to build that up to ideally sort of peaking at 10 miles or even up to 12 miles for some athletes. That's more sort of the elite running space. But that's the number one thing that I've noticed, that no athlete that is at the top level of the marathon, I mean, they all do that at least once a week. And the other amazing thing about threshold running, which is not necessarily the case for long, easy running, is threshold running also trains your brain to get used to running in a very uncomfortable feeling, right? And if you want to be good over the marathon, you have to get used to that, because there's no way around running a marathon to the best of your ability without being in quite a lot of discomfort for at least 30 minutes or maybe even up to an hour at the last stages of the marathon. And threshold running is uncomfortable, and your brain is often sending signals to you to stop, slow down much earlier than you actually can hold it for. And so if I told one of my athletes, let's take you, for example, Andrew, to do a 60-minute tempo run, after about 25 or 30 minutes, your body and your brain will start to say, I've had enough of this. I want to stop. But I know without a doubt that provided that there's no overtraining happening and you're not unwell, you probably can sustain that through to around an hour. And at the 45-minute mark, you'll be thinking, this is hell. I really want to stop. I don't like this. I'm uncomfortable. But you can continue and you can actually deal with that. And that is quite a magical sort of benefit there to deal with that discomfort and those thoughts, because Andrew, and anyone listening that has done marathons knows that that's just how it rolls at the end of a marathon if you run at 100% effort. And so you're not only training yourself physically, you're also training yourself mentally. And I think the mental training is something that a lot of people overlook a little bit. And I think doing some of these long threshold sessions, which I see athletes doing at the top end, is really critical. I think that's the main thing I've learned, is that there's just no way around that. You really must include that in your training if you want to perform to the best of your ability. There's a lot of other small things. I think one thing that's a bit of a sensitive topic, which I don't really think it's a great idea to dive deep into, because there's a lot of nuances to, and it's body composition, and it's your power to weight ratio and your body. And it's not something that's spoken about a lot because it can be sensitive. But I'm not someone to shy away from talking about sensitive topics. But the reason why I say it's a sensitive topic, and I don't really think it's a great idea to talk too much about it is there's some mental health risks involved in trying to get down to a very low weight. And I don't necessarily think that people should try and get as light as they can, but they do have to consider their body fat percentage. And this is speaking to people that want to see where their absolute peak performance lies. And if you're a marathon runner that just wants to get to the end and your goal is to finish, that's a different story. But if you want to try and see how fast you can possibly run, body composition does matter. And at the end of the day, if you watch all the major marathons and you take close note of the top 30, everyone's very thin and everyone's very, very low on fat. And so, you have to consider this to be an important factor. And it's something that I'm thinking about quite a lot in myself at the moment, because I carry quite a lot of weight for someone that's trying to run under 220. Part of that's muscle, part of that's fat, but I'm trying to sort of play around with that equation. That's probably the second big thing. And the third big thing is really long runs with really good quality blocks of pace within the long runs. When I first started my marathon journey in 2017, you could say, I thought long runs, just go out and do the distance. It doesn't really matter that much of the pace. As long as it's sort of not jogging, you're fine. And those long runs do work. And there's a place for 30 to 40K or 18 to 24 mile runs where there's no intensity involved. Like they are important, especially in the early stages of the marathon block. But some of the long runs where you include marathon effort blocks, which is sort of just off marathon goal pace, these are really crucial too. And that exercises the second lactate threshold point, which many would know as LT1, which is basically the point in which your lactate production starts to rise a little bit more exponentially. And you can do that in a test if you want, but that's typically the pace that you can sustain for about 2 to 3 hours. So for most people, that's marathon pace or marathon effort. And so doing a lot of volume around that in long runs on tired legs is really, really beneficial as well. So many lessons, but the three big ones I've just laid out there are LT2 threshold, body composition, and LT1 threshold. These three things are absolutely critical to a great marathon performance.
All right. Yeah, fantastic. So also, I have a side quest. We're trying to make it the whole way without saying double threshold. So just all right. And watch the donuts. Okay. And some marathon pace long runs. All right. So then I guess that brings us to the marathon. Talking specifically about marathon training, someone commented on my run this morning on Strava. It was like, whoa, what happened here? You were trying to break 3, and then I turn around and all of a sudden you're trying to break 250. You're in 250 shape. You've gotten a lot faster. Now, what I told him was, well, the only thing that I can see, I've been running all the time. The only thing that changed was I signed up with the Sweat Elite Coaching Academy. I signed up with Matt Fox. And what we've been doing is a speed block. We've been getting faster, and now we're translating that into marathon training. And it's the first time as a runner that I've really analyzed it and saying, oh, I thought you're getting faster through marathon training. I didn't know that there was maybe a difference. So what does it look like? What are the main differences between trying to get faster versus specifically marathon training?
So if you really think about it, it's something that Steven Scullion said really well in one of his videos. He's a YouTuber or a content creator. He actually ran 209 for the marathon, so very experienced. And he said something brilliant one day, which sort of answers this question. He said, if your marathon pace is, let's just say that it's 3 hours, and that's your goal. So that's 4:15 per kilometer, or I believe it's 6:52 per mile, and you're stuck on that for a while. If you then look at your 10K and 5K times, and the ability that you have to run over a 10K is 3:55 per kilometer, which I believe is about 6:20 per mile or 6:18 or something like that. And that's your limit. You can't possibly run faster than that at this point in time in the 10K. And that's off marathon training. Let's just say you've only done marathon training builds, but you've run a 10K race. In my eyes, it's basically impossible for you to improve over the marathon if you're stuck at that 10K ability, because you're never going to be able to run your 10K pace for the full marathon. And you're not even really going to be able to run overly very close. So you're not going to be able to run within 15 seconds per mile or 10 seconds per kilometer of your 10K pace in the marathon distance. So then you start to think, okay, well, if I improve my 10K pace and I get that a bit down to be able to run 3:45 per kilometer or 6 minutes per mile, what does that mean for the marathon? And that must mean that, well, if you're able to run that effort for the 10K, your times in the marathon, realistically, if you're able to continue your marathon training, should also come down. And then you start to think, hang on, does this same rule apply all the way down the board to the point where maybe I have to get faster over like 100 meters? Because if I'm too slow over 100 meters and I can only run it in, say, 16 seconds, which is 235 or 240 per kilometer with about 420 per mile, something like that. If that's your limit of speed, then everything above that is going to be limited to some extent. So then you start to think, okay, well, maybe I should try and focus on running faster over like the 400 meters or the 800 meters or the mile. And if you can do that and keep everything else constant, keep your aerobic capacity the same, your power the same, your general strength the same, then your paces really should come down. So I think what we've seen in your training, Andrew, is that you've improved your ability to race over the 5K and the 10K, and probably even the 3K and the mile quite a lot as well, which has then brought down, and you've kept your aerobic, because we've kept enough aerobic and a little bit of LT1 marathon fitness in there in the long runs. We're doing these long runs from time to time, actually pretty much every second weekend, where the second half of it is pretty steady, pretty close to marathon effort. So you're keeping that marathon fitness there and just sort of maintaining it while you're really working on the faster paces. And so what's happened is your threshold paces and your VO2 max paces and everything faster than marathon pace has improved. And so now you're more efficient, you're faster, and it's clearly worked, because we're seeing indications in your training and also in some of these applications that we're using, which we can talk about later, to show that you're in probably closer to 250 to 252 shape, when the original goal was to break 3. So yeah, I think that's probably the best way to put it. And it's something that many people don't really think about this way. They think, oh, maybe I'm limited by my speed, and if I've hit a stagnation with my marathon, hammering the same end, the long runs and the slow aerobic runs, you may be maxed out at that point. You may be at a point where it's like there's really no more to give. The options now are to see if my power to weight ratio can improve, i.e. get lighter, or get faster over the 5K and the 3K and the 10K, or both. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then for me, I'm a person who likes to visualize it, make it more concrete. So like a week of training that is more speed focused versus a week of training that is inside of a marathon block. What are maybe one or two differences of what that would actually look like as far as like workouts go?
Yeah. So when we're in what you would call speed block, you would basically do two sessions within the week that are faster than marathon pace. So one session would be closer to 3K, 5K pace, maybe even with a little bit of mile pace work in there. And the total volume will be around about 4 to 5 miles of work. So if you add up all of the hard intervals, that's about the total volume of work. It might be a little bit more than that at times. It depends a little bit. But everything will basically be geared around improving your VO2 max or your lactate ability to buffer lactic acid. There's many different buzzwords you could use here, but it's all really just speed. It's all really just getting used to running faster than marathon pace, becoming efficient and easier at those speeds. And that's typically one of the workouts. The other workouts is threshold, like I was saying before. And given that we know that threshold pace is the pace that you can hold for about an hour, that obviously is faster than marathon pace as well, because you're not running the marathon in an hour. So that will also be what you could also call a speed session, because in my mind, speed work is always faster than the race pace that you're trying to do. So in the case of a marathon runner, threshold is in a way kind of speed work too, but that's just words. But yeah, so you'll do an interval session, a threshold session, and the threshold session will be between maybe 5 miles and up to 8 miles, maybe sometimes in some experienced runners up to 10 miles worth of work at that intensity. And the long run will be a little bit different to the marathon long runs in that usually at least half of it or even more of it is at quite a easy to medium effort. And there's loads of reasons why that's effective. It's very physiological. There's a lot of benefit to just the general muscles and tendons and ligaments running at that sort of moderate effort for a long time. There's capillary development. There's all these other buzzwords, of which, to be brutally honest, I'm not super knowledgeable about the science around that, but I do know the basics to understand that it's necessary. And we'll normally tack on the end of maybe every second week of the long run some LT1 marathon effort work just to keep that there. So that's what a normal speed work week will look like. And ideally, when a runner gets used to that sort of week, then we might add in 1 or 2 workouts too, where there's some strides at the end, some fast 100-meter run throughs, and maybe even some hill sprints if athletes are getting very advanced. But switching over to the marathon week, everything then focuses on the long run on the weekend. The long run is the key workout of the week when you're in marathon specific phase, and that will always be within 10 weeks of the marathon. And the long run will basically start at around about 15 miles, 16 miles or 25K and build up to ideally doing one run. For most people, it depends a little bit on the experience of the athlete, but for most people, we will peak at doing one run of pretty close to 38 to 40 kilometers or 24 miles with about 4 weeks to go. That might be 3 weeks to go, it might be 5 weeks to go. It depends a little bit on if the athlete's doing a tune-up half marathon or 10K, or how the build's going. And that long run will build up to include more and more of that run at marathon effort, which is basically marathon pace adjusted to your conditions and your fatigue, which is typically 3 to 5% off slower than marathon pace. And the other workout in the week when you're in marathon specific mode is a session that I like to call a hybrid session, because it's basically a combination of the two other sessions we were doing in the speed block. It's a bit of threshold and a bit of VO2 max, all in the one run. Those two workouts are basically the only two really hard workouts in the week. We might do, with some experienced runners, a progressive run as well of 70 to 80, maybe even sometimes up to 90 minutes, where it'll be easy and start and finish hard. But I usually also do put as a note on those runs that if you're feeling really tired in that progressive run, don't do the progression, just finish the easy nature of it. So it really switches from being the focus of the week in the speed block is the speed sessions, the two speed sessions, and the long run sort of the secondary. And the marathon specific phase, it's the long run is really the focus, and then the hybrid session is sort of the secondary, and then all else is secondary too. So yeah, it's a bit of a switch for sure when it comes from when you compare the 2 weeks in speed and marathon block.
Awesome. And as as your runners get closer to the marathon, as you yourself get closer to the marathon, I know we mentioned it earlier. I'm a stat guy. I'm a nerd guy. I love CR plots. I love these race predictor apps, Kaizen, and such. But before then, pre-apps, you're still going to have to make assessments of how runners are doing as they get closer to the race. So I noticed for example, like in Clayton Young's series that he was doing, they have marathon predictor workouts. Do you prescribe marathon predictor workouts?
I do. There's a little bit. I did watch their series. I thought it was really good. I tend to do the prediction workouts when the marathon comes closer. So there's two workouts that I'd normally prescribe to see where the athlete is at, and it's 4x5K, which is basically 4 by 3 miles, and then 2x10K, which is basically 2x6 miles. And they'll typically come 5 weeks and maybe 2 weeks out from the race. But I've always got a pretty firm understanding as to where the prediction might be, because I'm looking at the athletes doing threshold sessions and I'm seeing their threshold paces, and marathon pace is typically 3 to 5% slower than threshold pace for most people. Sometimes it's a little bit more than that if the athlete's a little bit new to marathon, but it's normally pretty easy for me to determine where that pace will be, or at least a pretty good guess. Because if the athlete's doing threshold sessions of, say, 6 by a mile at 6-minute mile pace, and that feels like threshold to them, it doesn't feel all out. It feels like it's their half marathon effort, or the effort they can sustain for an hour. My mind will immediately say, okay, well, if their threshold pace is 6 minutes per mile or 3:44 per kilometer, their marathon pace would be around 6:20 or 6:25. About 3 to 5% slower, or in kilometers, it'd probably be about 3:55 to 3:57, because that's normally the case with people if they train well. But to answer the question specifically, yes, I do have those two sessions that I can normally give a good gauge as to where the prediction is. And when I watched that series, I thought it was interesting that they did that, but I almost thought, you guys kind of know, I feel like you guys would have known what that pace would have been before that workout. So I almost think it's cool to watch, and I've actually seen a few people on Strava start doing them, but I'm like, I think you already sort of knew that your prediction would be that beforehand. I know they're normally running like 4:47, 4:46. They're 2:07 guys. That's exactly 2:07 pace. So it's in a little part of me, sorry to be critical of the series, but I was a little bit like, well, it's not like you were going to go out and do 4:30s, right? Which would have been 2:05 or 2:04 marathon pace. You could sort of always see it coming that they were going to run about 4:47, 4:48, or somewhere between 4:45 and 4:50, which would have given them a prediction of 2:06, 2:07. And the variables there just would have been in weather or in on hills. There's a few different ideas there for marathon prediction workouts.
And I made a video in my Breaking 3 series last year, which was like how much mileage to break 3, just playing around with the idea of mileage. Of course, we've got a potpourri of answers from 80 miles a week to like, oh yeah, I jogged 20 miles a week and ran a 3 or whatever, people flexing. But does mileage, I know you're experimenting this go around in your blog with some higher mileage, does it greatly matter, or does it just maybe generally matter for the marathon?
It's funny. I've been involved in running for 17 years and marathon running for, you could say, 6-7 years. And I still don't think I have a brilliant answer to this. But mileage matters, but when people start to convince you that it's everything, that's not true. Because I know of people that have run under 2 hours 20 for the marathon, off less than 60 miles a week by doing a little bit of cross training. But then I've known people that have basically committed to a huge mileage block and run really, really well too. So it's really tough to know what the exact answer is to this question. There's no getting around the fact that mileage does absolutely count and it matters. I don't think I've seen too many people run exceptionally fast marathons. And when I say exceptionally fast, I mean pretty close to the Olympic standard or around there. To be honest, I've never really seen anyone hit those sort of times without doing pretty high mileage. So by high mileage, I mean 100 miles a week or more for at least 10 weeks. So that just sort of goes to show that, well, maybe it is really important for that really top end. But I've coached a lot of people that have run really quick under 2:30 marathons off pretty low mileage. They've dealt with like an injury and they've had to basically manage it with some biking or some swimming, and they've come out and run very, very well. So there's definitely something to be said for easy volume being swapped out with cross training, especially cycling. There's something to be said for that. And do you count that cross training as volume? No, I guess, but I think it's something to consider. I mean, a great example of that is a friend of mine, triathlete, who went to the Olympics, Morgan Pearson. He's run 101 for a half marathon. Admittedly, he hasn't run a marathon yet, but he's run 101 for a half marathon. And he does about 50 miles a week of running. But that's about 70 kilometers, or maybe slightly more, maybe closer to 90 kilometers or 55, 60 miles. But he does, on top of that, 12 to 14 hours of other training, right? Of cycling and swimming. So that's got to help. But then do you say, oh, he ran 101 off 90 kilometers? Well, that's not the full story. So yes and no. It definitely matters for sure. And I'm doing an experiment now just because I want to see if it really works for me, if it does move the needle. So I'm experimenting with sort of shifting from, historically speaking, probably closer to 80 miles a week to about 100 to 110, 160 to 175 kilometers for the sort of 7 weeks leading into the Chicago Marathon. And we'll see. I'm big on experimentation just to see what works and what doesn't. And I'm more than happy to even run an experiment, especially myself, that I'm not even sure if it will work, but I'll just say, look, have belief in it, have faith in it, see if it works. But oftentimes you're experimenting with 2 or 3 things at once, and so you sometimes come to this result when you're like, I'm not really sure which one it was that worked. And I'm doing a few things right now, including really being quite strict with my diet, which I've never really done that much before. So back to the question, I do think it matters. I think some people overstate how much it matters, but there's also a thing that I talk about from time to time on podcasts and on my own content about lifetime mileage, and lifetime mileage is a big thing too. The more running that you do, the stronger that you'll be over time, the faster you'll get fitter, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I don't know. I'd be keen to hear what you think about that at some point, whether you want to answer now or another time, but I think that's my best answer for now.
Yeah, I'm the jury's out still. I do think it matters. I think it matters more the less fit you are. So like, say, I do believe in all of those like race predictors and taking the overall volume and the speed at which you run that overall volume as a training load. And if you're going to run a ton of volume at a slower pace, then that's kind of the person who's like, yeah, I ran a sub 3 on 80 miles a week, who doesn't necessarily have that top end speed, right? But like somebody like you who could run 6:52 a mile as an easy pace to a sub 3, then you could say, yeah, I went out and I ran a 5K every day and that's it. And then I ran a sub 3 because you're overall fitter. So I think the fitter you are, the less mileage required, depending on what that target is. But that's where I'm at. But speaking of experimenting, have you ever experimented with the over distance long run? Have you ever done any of that?
I have. I've done 2 runs of 45 kilometers before, which is 28, I think, miles, give or take, maybe half a mile. Still not sure if it helped. I don't think it definitely didn't do any damage, which you would assume that's possible. But yeah, twice I've done 45k runs. Interestingly enough, I've discovered something in myself which doesn't make really any sense. But I've done a couple of marathons very well that I've done an extremely long run like within 10 days of the marathon. So one time in Germany last year, I did a 45k run, and then 9 days later, did a marathon for training, which I know I was experimenting again, and ran a 2:23:50 something at the Hanover Marathon, and it was pretty comfortable. There's a whole background story around that and why I did it, but and last year one of my best races was at Fukuoka Marathon in Japan, and 9 days earlier, I think 10 days before that, I did a 40k run. And so I've noticed that in myself, I have a really sort of strange setup where long runs really close to a race tend to not affect me at all, and in some weird way almost make me feel better in the race, which, I don't know how that works. But the over-distance runs are interesting. I do see a lot of professionals trying it. I know Emil Caress from the UK, who came fourth at the Paris Olympics. I know that he did at least one 45k run in his build-up. I'm really not super sure if it's helpful or not, or whether or not the 40k distance or the 24-mile distance is enough. I really haven't got a firm answer to that yet, but I do think they're worth trying for sure, especially people that are really struggling in the final stages of the marathon.
Yeah, and the back-to-back marathons, the CJ Albertson, I guess we can call it, load it up, 7 days later, just do it again.
Yeah.
All right, so let's switch to from marathon training to marathon pacing strategy. Obviously, a lot changes depending on what the weather's going to look like. Like the Marine Corps Marathon has a lot of elevation in the front end in the first 15K or so that would probably, change things slightly or a little bit. But assuming it's a flat course, it's 45 degrees Fahrenheit outside, beautiful weather conditions, what have you found to be an ideal or the best pacing strategy for the marathon?
Pacing strategy, I think you have to understand where your LT1 fitness is. And so that comes as a result of looking at the threshold paces, and like I explained in the last question or the question before, and then doing some of those workouts, 4x5K or 2x10K. And I think then, to be honest, the best way to do it is something that a lot of, at least this is going to sound weird, a lot of non-Africans struggle with. So African runners, more specifically Kenyan runners, are very good for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons why they're good is they have this, they don't often use GPS very well, and they're not super familiar with it. They're more inclined to, join a group of people and just run with them. They're very, very good at going, okay, my marathon pace is this 3 minutes per kilometer or 4:50 per mile, which are some of the best ones, obviously. And when they hit a hill, they're very good at intuitively knowing what the same effort is by going up the hill. And so they won't even look at their watch and go, oh, up the hill I need to do 3:10 per kilometer. To them, it's like, the pace doesn't matter. It's just like, keep the effort there. Like, they're very good at intuitively knowing what that effort is. And it's probably as a result of them not using GPS very much. Whereas when you're so used to looking at GPS and so used to looking at pace, and I would argue it's not a great thing, really, to be really, like, a lot of people, especially that were started running in the last 3 or 4 years through COVID, or they very much Andrew's got his hand up, and this isn't a criticism. This is just a fact and how it works. They'll often start running and their original dopamine hits, their original, like, not necessarily meaning, but the way that they enjoyed running is to chase numbers, is to find a number on a screen and say, I want to run this number. And that makes sense. Like, chasing numbers is very powerful, even outside of running. When people put financial bonuses on people's paychecks, people will strive for the bonus and so on and so forth. So it's the same sort of concept. In running, you'll strive for the number. But if you can't ever listen to your body and everything is about the number, that makes pacing hilly marathons hard. Because if you can't run like that and you have to be told a certain pace, that's pretty tricky. But my stronger suggestion would be to know what that feeling is through workouts, and then be able to basically run up and down the hills at the right effort. Because I can guarantee you, if you watch the Paris Marathon, speaking more specifically to the men's race, it was very, very hilly in the middle section of the course. And I can guarantee you that almost all of those athletes did not have a set pace to run at. They were just running at the right effort. And there were some hills in there, if you watched it closely, that were very steep. There was one that was very steep up and then very, very steep down. And I can guarantee you those guys were not thinking, oh, up that hill I'm going to run 5:20 mile pace. They were just trying to basically manage their effort and not blow over their threshold. And that's a skill. I think that's something that can be taught in training. So, for you, Andrew, at Marine Corps with 15K of pretty hilly, elevation at the start. I think it's just around making sure to check in with yourself constantly. Like, does this effort feel right? Does this effort feel right? And maybe having a rough idea around the pace early on is good, but I think sticking to an exact pace and relentlessly looking at the watch up those hills is not a good idea. I just do think you have to constantly be thinking to yourself, like, does this feel right? Does this feel good? And a big bonus if you can run with someone that's obviously sharing that journey with you and sharing the goal with you, so you can both check in with each other. But it's tricky. It's not easy to do. And Boston Marathon being one of the marquee, more popular races in the US, which is hilly, it's a topic of conversation that comes up every year. Everyone's like, how do you pace these hills through the middle? And I think at the end of the day, that the best method is to understand what your marathon effort is, and then just really try to manage your effort up and down the hills.
Yeah, and I will say that is something that was new to me, and I've put that in the video when I joined the Sweat Elite Coaching Academy, was that everything was by effort. 5K effort, 10K effort, half marathon effort, marathon pace effort. And that was a little foreign to me because I am a COVID runner, so I started running. I'm attached to these numbers. I used to train, went down the rabbit hole of low heart rate, did the heart rate training. So I'm familiar with the heart rate averages of around what those paces are by looking at results and looking at the heart rate. But then I had a coach, and it was like pace, run 6 at 9 minutes, run this at that. So I was running by paces for a while, but never really focused on the effort. And so I felt like it was really beneficial, and it was also mentally freeing. And then the pace is going to land wherever it's going to land, despite where I want to will my end result to be. It's like the course is the course,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
All right, now lastly, you are a very well-traveled man, so I want to give a little bit of any wisdom or advice you may have for people who are traveling this fall to marathons, major marathons, Chicago, Berlin, New York. It's that time. There's a lot of different time zones. Do you have any advice for people traveling across time zones for adjustments?
I do. Yeah. So you have to be careful. You have to understand what the time difference is. Obviously, that's the first thing, and try to understand, what the difference is. But after that, I think there's a pretty big difference between traveling, say, 2 hours. I mean, both are hard, but one's much harder than the other. And the first one is traveling maybe across the US, where there's a 3-hour time difference. But then there's quite a big difference between traveling maybe to Europe, where there's a 7 to 8 hour difference. They're both tricky, but the Europe one's much trickier. But I think sleeping aid is something that I do lean on quite a bit. And there's no rule for this. So some people respond to melatonin, some people go and get a prescription from a doctor, some people find teas, chamomile teas. These things are really, really helpful for me. I have a couple of different things that I like to use, but these are pretty critical for me, and I really try and plan backwards. So I go, okay, well, if I want to be in bed at 9:30, I want to finish eating at 7 o'clock and then make sure I'm in bed by 8 o'clock, and really try and eliminate all possible things that will keep you from getting up. So if you're meeting someone for dinner, you have to maybe tell them beforehand that you're pretty keen on getting to bed early and all these sorts of things. It can be a little bit antisocial at times, but I think it's important. I mean, getting a good night's sleep, especially I've actually really realize that the night of sleep you have before the race is a little bit less important than actually what most people think. I know people that have run Olympic qualifying times having not really slept at all the night before because they're so nervous. But I think that second last night and third last night, that's a very different story. You really want to try to make sure that those nights are really good. And ideally, you want to make sure the night before is good too. But maybe some people will find peace in hearing the fact that I've even run exceptionally well in races having slept pretty poorly the night before. But doing everything that you can to try and make sure that you do sleep well is always going to help. The other big thing is before you book a hotel or you go and stay somewhere, I mean, doing little things like trying to understand, does the place have air conditioning, and maybe even giving them a call and making sure that it does. That's a big deal. I've listened to quite a few podcasts about sleep and really tried to work on my own sleep in the last 6 months, which has really helped. And conditions of a room are a big deal, temperature, so forth. So making sure that the area that you're sleeping in isn't too noisy, and making sure that you're not in a part of the city where there might be a lot of sirens and noise. I think there's all these little small things that you can do, which are kind of common sense. But I think if you just really break them down and make sure you eliminate all those possible disruptions, you can do your best. But sometimes they're a little bit out of your control. Sometimes I was in Japan and I was doing a marathon one day, and the night before there was just a whole lot of sirens outside. I don't even know what they were, police and fire brigade and stuff, and kept me up all night. And yeah, that was a bit of a bummer. So sometimes there's nothing you can really do about it. But I think just really trying to understand what those time differences are and then really plan for those differences, I think is is pretty crucial. But one mistake I see a lot of Americans make is they'll book to Berlin Marathon or to Tokyo Marathon, and they'll fly in on like the Friday night with a Sunday morning race, and I'm like, oh man, that's close. Like that's really hard to get your time because a time difference of 6 hours plus, it really does require a few days to adjust, probably closer to 4 or 5 days. Now, I understand that people work and they might not be able to get the time off, but I have had some conversations with people where they really could have booked a few days earlier. And yeah, and like I said, I understand that's not so easy for some people. It's also costly to stay a little bit longer, but if you can really try and make sure you get there 4 days before, 5 days before. That's if it's more than a 6 hour time difference. But yeah, I think all these little things do add up. But I think the sleeping aid is one thing that helps me the most. Just making sure that you have something that you can consume and take. Chamomile tea works for me. And Reem, my fiance, melatonin completely sorts her out. Doesn't really work for me that well, but that's a little bit individual and something that I can't specifically advise, like what it is, but searching for that thing is a good idea, whatever that may be. So, and taking it with you and making sure that you consume it.
Awesome. Yeah, I fumbled the Buffalo Marathon last year. For many reasons, getting dressed up as Forrest Gump wasn't a bright idea either, but we went over there. The start time was 6:30 Eastern time, and I'm in Central, and so that means it would start at my time at 5:30. I usually wake up a couple hours before, which means the day of the marathon, I woke up 3:30 in my biological clock time, and I never woke up once like that for in training, so I wasn't as prepared. I got there like Friday at midnight for the Sunday race, or it was like Thursday at midnight for a Saturday race. I did give myself no time. And then to your point, we stayed at an Airbnb, me and my wife, and there's no air conditioning. So we just like opened the window, and then like my throat's sore and like whatever. I'm like, why don't they have air conditioning up here in the Northeast? Like it's crazy. So I was not prepared. So even today we're booking flights out to DC, and she's like, why don't we just go out on Friday? And I'm like, no. Learned our lesson. We're going out there a little bit earlier to get more acclimated. All right, sweet. So now let's switch to Matt Fox, the runner, on a 220 journey, sub 220 journey, right?
Definitely sub.
Working out.
I've already run 220, but yeah.
Sub, yeah. Sub. How are you feeling about your Chicago build?
I'm feeling very good. The only thing that I'm concerned about, which being concerned or worried will never help you, so realistically I'm not worried, but it is a factor, and it's just the heat. Anyone that has followed my journey even for an hour would know that I have a really hard time in the heat. I got heat stroke pretty badly in 2016 when I was living in Singapore, and Singapore was hot and humid all year. And I had an incident where I wasn't hospitalized, but I probably should have been. It was at the end of a triathlon relay where I was doing the half marathon leg, and I was not even fit at all. I was actually quite unfit at the time. I wasn't really training, but ever since then, anyone that knows about this knows that if you've had heat stroke once, you have a really hard time with the heat. It's very hard to explain, but your sweat rate increases quite a bit. You have a really hard time mentally dealing with it. It's almost like you have a little bit of weird trauma, and when it gets really hot, you have all these warning signs in your head being like, "Don't go there again." And so my only concern is if it's warm on the day, I'm in a bit of trouble. But I think if it's cool on the day, and what I mean by cool is under 50 degrees or under 10 degrees Celsius, I have a really good feeling about this one. I do think that I'm in my best shape ever. I know I've said that before at least 2 times in different builds, but I think I'm probably in better shape than those two. I'm racing a half this weekend, and it's not the fastest course, but it's pretty good. And I hope to run a personal best there in the half, and that'll be a big confidence boost if I do. But yeah, everything's going to plan. I'm hitting paces in training that I've never really been able to hit comfortably before, and hopefully the high volume helps, and I think also being a little bit lighter will help. So at the moment I'm really confident about the race. I'm just really hoping that it's not going to be warm.
Yeah, no, I ran it in 2022 and it was perfect weather, and one of the mistakes I made was overhydrating because I trained all through the Texas summer, and it was the second worst in history. And so I was just like taking in all these fluids, and I was like, I don't need this bottle, halfway through or whatever. But so what's different in this build than in previous builds, if anything?
Doing a huge speed block for 5 months beforehand. I'm basically trying to be as fast as possible over the mile on the 5K, focusing more on my diet and trying to get a little bit lighter. That's a big thing. And doing a little bit high volume. Oh, there's actually another thing. I'm doing, I wouldn't say it's extensive strength work, but twice a week, I'm doing some pretty basic exercises in the gym. Just really 4 exercises: leg press, single leg squat, Nordics, which is like a hamstring exercise where you've sort of got your legs locked in and you're sort of slowly leaning down to get a lot of traction on your hamstrings. And then calf raises on the leg press machine. So those things. So there's quite a few things that are new. This build, the gym. The reason why I haven't done gym before is this is an excuse that people often think is lame, but until they actually travel, they realize it's actually pretty hard. When you're traveling around the world and you don't have a fixed gym, it's actually kind of hard to do gym. It's not impossible, but it requires spending a lot more money than usual because you're buying day passes all the time. And oftentimes, the gyms doesn't have the equipment that you need, or it's very, very busy or whatnot. So, you can make it happen when you're traveling, but it's harder. But this time I'm staying in one place and I've got a gym in my building. So that's helpful. So yeah, those four things: speed, really focusing on the diet, doing higher volume, and strength work. So quite a few new things.
Okay, awesome. Now, and then on the speed block, you've gotten faster. Did you bookend the speed block with, like, say, a 5K at the beginning and 5K at the end, and you can say it got faster? Or is there any tangible metrics that you look at to know, or is it just your pace at easy runs to know that you got faster?
I did have a 5K race booked in the middle of July, and it was a bummer because about a week and a half before it, I've had Achilles tendinopathy for about 4 years, and it comes and goes, and it's normally under control. It's been pretty under control since 2021, and my Achilles started to get really sore right around the time of the 5K race, and I tried to understand why. And what I came up with was that running in spikes, which is what I had to run in the 5K. I could have worn super shoes, but theoretically that's actually against the rules of world athletics. You're not supposed to wear super shoes on the track. Now, most people don't care about that, but if you're really trying to abide by the rules, you should. And also doing a lot of track work, running around circles, was also aggravating my Achilles. So I wasn't able to race that race. I decided not to race it. But I think some workouts that I've been able to do, specifically shortly after that, I did 10 by 1K in 3 minutes with a minute rest, and I've never been able to do that before. And just running at that pace, that 450 per mile pace, 3 minutes per kilometer pace, I just know that it's never really been that comfortable before to be able to repeat that over and over and over again with a minute rest. I've never been able to do that before. So that's one indication. But yeah, unfortunately I missed the big test, which would have been good. And I was really trying to sort of aim to run close to 14:10, 14:15 there. And I think I hopefully could have done that if the conditions were good. So unfortunately no real key metrics, but I think just based on everything in training, I can tell that it's definitely helped.
Sweet. Now, I know in previous marathon attempts, you've run 220, 221, 222. You're in that area, ready to break through, and we're on pace in some of those and experience some cramping. Is there a similar PTSD like with the heat stroke around the cramping? Do you have any anxiety around that?
I don't. I really don't. A lot of people have wondered if it's mental. And I really, really have a hard time believing that. Because I'm pretty optimistic in general, and when I line up in races, I do not worry about the cramping. I just don't. In fact, I think I've done remarkably well, like patting myself on the back to just be like, forget it. It's not a factor. It's not a factor. And I say that because a few times I've maybe not raced a marathon for 6 months and I've come back and raced a marathon. When I start cramping at the 22 mile mark or 21 mile mark, I'm quite shocked. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's right. This happens to me. And so that sort of tells me that it's not something that I really worry about or I'm anxious about. So I don't think so, no.
Cool. Now we'll transition to a little bit more on like the motivational side, the inner workings of Matt Fox. Do you feel any external pressure? As somebody who's, I guess, in the public eye with a YouTube channel and in the running scene?
I don't. I know a lot of people that do, and even a lot of people that don't have YouTube channel or a podcast. I used to a little bit, maybe a few years ago, but I don't know. I think over time I just sort of realized that, hey, no one's losing sleep over my performances, or if I run poorly or well. Like, some people care a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's all just sort of interesting to people, and a lot of people are just trying to learn from what the mistakes I'm making and maybe some of the successes that I'm having. Especially the cramping thing. I feel like if I do solve that eventually, there'll be a lot of people curious to know how. But no, I don't really feel that much pressure. I think about professional athletes. I'll tell you what probably helps is when I was a middle distance runner, I was really trying to be professional at that point. So I was trying to make it my career, and I never really earned enough money to make it a full-time job. But I had some sponsors from time to time, and they would put me on 1 and 2 year contracts, and that was pressure because if I didn't perform, they're gone. Right. And I think now I'm like, well, my living and my career and my income to provide for myself and, my fiance and my family. I don't have a family now, but I'm 37, so probably soon. Savings, should I say. It doesn't rely on my performance anymore. So I think it probably helps that I spent 7 years with that pressure and now it's off. So that probably helps. But I don't really feel pressure that much. And I usually do tell myself the day before a race, like, it doesn't really matter how I run tomorrow. No one's going to lose sleep over it. but hopefully I run well.
Yeah, absolutely. And for mantras, are you like a kumbaya smile kind of guy, or are you like a everybody bulletin board material kind of guy?
No, I'm more of a smile kind of guy. I'm just, I do know a few people that are a little bit like the F everybody else, but no, I just think it's, it's you against you at the end of the day with the marathon. It's a bit of a team sport for sure, and having a coach and athletes and a team definitely helps. But at the end of the day, it's just you versus you. So, yeah.
Awesome. Now, I did want to ask this too earlier, but I wanted to get into the content a little bit more than ask the question. But when I asked what you learned from traveling abroad, and you said, well, for shorter distance or for the marathon specifically, and then it was like, what mental tricks or tips have you learned anything about the mental approach to running from your travel with Sweat Elite?
I do think that you sort of touched on this a little bit, and you've been sending me some messages over the last few months about this, and it's as have some other athletes. And I think learning to get away from judging workouts as wins or losses. So if you set goal paces in training, which I think can sometimes be useful for sure, but if it's always an outcome of, I'll give an example. If we have a workout of 10 by 1K and we say we want to do this in 3:30, 5:37 mile pace, and if the view on that is if I hit the 3:30 it's a win or faster, and if I don't it's a fail, I don't think that's a great place to be often, to always be thinking win or loss. And I think most of the best athletes avoid that, and their coaches help them avoid that. And so they say, okay, well, we're going to do this to effort, and whatever comes out. And we have to understand that today is going to be 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 90% humidity, which is what you've been training. In fact, that's a cold day for you, right, at the moment. So that's going to massively change your paces. And so I think remaining in a positive headspace and thinking, I finished the work at the right effort, and that's what's going to make me feel confident. If you repeat that 2-3 times a week, every week, you're in a much better headspace going into a race than thinking, I failed half the workouts and I succeeded at half the workouts. That's probably not the best place to be. And so I think, there's one British athlete, Andy Butchart, who came, I believe it was 5th or 6th at the Rio Olympics in the 5K. And when I did 3 videos with him, you can see them all on YouTube, Andy Butchart, I did them in 2022, I think, or 2021, the videos. He was very much like that. He was like, everything's just effort. I'm doing 10 800s today. The pace is what it is. I'm going to run at 5K effort, and then whatever comes out. And he didn't matter. It didn't care to him if he was running the 800s in 202 or 208, like somewhere in the middle there. And I think that's a pretty big deal. And you'll really notice that in Africa, because they often don't even really know if paces are good or not. Like, they just run to effort and run as a group. And so I think that's something that it's hard for people to wrap their head around, especially if they're very intellectual and very good at math. You would assume that, the smarter you get and the better you get with numbers, the better you'll get with running. Funnily enough, that actually doesn't work. It doesn't really work like that. It almost works the opposite in many ways. So I've really learned that in the last, really 17 years. I started to get a vibe of that even very early on in my middle distance days.
All right, sweet. Now, also, I want to float this one out. So people watch my channel are getting started running a little bit later in life. So I've learned most of everything from, I didn't run in high school, I didn't run at all before. So like what I've learned from Sir Stephen Scullion, from your channel, from other channels. YouTube has been some of my best teachers. And one of the things I think I learned this year in year 4, I think we're coming up on year 5, but is the workout, right? Like, so, speed session. We're going to do this workout. And I've gone to the well. That's what my association is with it, right? And this year I'm learning more. You were talking to Ryan Hall, and he was like something about, making a deposit, not taking a withdrawal from a workout. And then there was something in the Sweat Elite Discord about Grant Fisher's coach saying something about not doing last one, fast one. So what is your overall philosophy or thoughts on the effort required for these speed sessions?
There's a wonderful place to strike that I always call 9 out of 10 effort. 9 out of 10 RPE, 90% effort, which is just that one gear away from being all out. And I think that's a perfect place to be. So really trying to make sure that you finish the workout where if I stopped you, if I'm coaching you, Andrew, and I'm at the track and we've got 5 by 1600, as you said, you should always be finishing thinking to yourself, this was a 9 out of 10 effort. It wasn't 10 out of 10. If I had to, I could have gone a little bit faster in that last one. I probably could have dropped another 10 seconds in the 1600 if I'd squeezed it out and gone 100%. I don't think you get anything more out of doing that in training. And oftentimes it's actually a detriment because you find it harder to recover, probably more mentally than anything else than physically, but both. And I think I've really noticed that in the professional athletes as well, which is interesting because you've asked me a lot of questions about what I've learned, but this actually hasn't come up. And it's that I think running to that 90% effort in training, Kipchoge actually talks about this quite a bit. I think he actually says 80% or 85%, but I think 90%, especially in the speed workouts, you could argue that 85% in the thresholds and the long runs makes sense. But I think in the speed workouts, I think that 90% effort and really making sure that you could always do one more or run a little bit faster in that last one, I really do think that's important. So I agree with Grant Fisher's coach. I really do.
Yeah, so 90% for mere mortals. Kipchoge only 80 or 85. if you're a 2 to 205 guy, maybe 85%.
Yeah.
All right, so now we can switch over to my training. So I have not really, like you said, when we've been talking about running in the heat and humidity, not really focused on paces or results as much, mostly to protect my self-esteem and just to feel better about myself. And then now, as we get into some of the marathon specific stuff, taking glances and looks at it, looking at race predictors, seeing 250, hitting marathon pace efforts at around 630, which would match that 250. Obviously, it's early on. I think someone put in the comments after one of the runs, and they're like, your heart rate's too high to sustain that, whatever. It's like, yeah, we're 9 weeks out. Like, if I was already ready to go, for like next week to run it, I would probably be shooting for something more. But so we've got 8 weeks into the race. How far from the race do you think we will have a good indication of what a runner is capable of, in this case, me?
It's tricky for someone like you because of the conditions you're training in. And you're training in conditions right now that are very tough. I know one of my very good friends, Luke, who's also in Texas. I talk to him all the time. He's training in the same conditions, which is always 90% and 75 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or 23 degrees to 33 degrees Celsius. It's hard because if you go out and do a 12-mile tempo run, which if someone really wants to know, what their marathon pace is, I would, and this is not something I very rarely do, but I'd be like, well, if you go out and run 12 miles, basically, 95% effort on your own in good conditions, that will normally tell you roughly what your marathon pace would be. It'd be about that, because if you do it on your own, it's a lot harder than doing it in a group. If you just do it slightly off 100% effort, you're running probably close to LT1 towards the very end or through most of it. But for you, if you went out and did a 12-mile tempo run there, you wouldn't be able to. I think you would run slower than your actual marathon pace because of the conditions. So it's a little bit hard, to be honest, to know. But the faster you run in training, and the more stuff you do down that threshold. And I've seen your paces in training around the threshold pace of 5-minute intervals and intervals that are a little bit shorter, which are a little bit easier to get through in the heat. I'm just basically adjusting that percentage of 3 to 5% to the marathon pace, and I think that's basically what Kaizen is doing as well. It's noticing what efforts you're doing at in threshold, and then understanding what that would be for the marathon pace. And so I think that these predictions of 250 to 252 are pretty good. Your volume is quite good, but I think as it gets cooler and we get closer to the marathon, we'll start to do some of those workouts like 4x3 miles and 2x6 miles, and get a really firm understanding so that you can go into the race thinking, yeah, I really can run this pace to run 251 or 252 or whatever it is we decide to do as it gets closer. So I think it's definitely much easier to determine a marathon goal pace when you're training in 50 degrees and 50% humidity. It makes it much trickier when we're dealing with heat and humidity, which is something that's a little bit hard to coach through, to be honest, because people want to know what their marathon pace is, and when they're training in such hot conditions, it's hard to really know. And I have athletes message me 2-3 times a week saying, I don't know if I'm fit. I don't know if I've moved the needle. And I say, yeah, like, you're training in insanely hot conditions. It's really hard to know. So not sure that was a great answer, but it's probably the best one I have.
No, that's good. Yeah, well, the last 2 summers were the worst 2 summers in history in Texas, so they were absolutely brutal. And so it's made this summer feel relatively mild. And on Sunday, the temps that usually are 75 to 80 in the morning are now going down to 59 or 60.
Oh,
So
beautiful.
I'm looking for some, yeah, it's going to be a nice long run on the weekend. So, and now we mentioned this a little bit earlier, Marine Corps, there's some elevation in the first 15K. It looks mostly a lot in the first 5K, and then there's one other hill, and then it goes flat for most of it. And of course, it's notoriously ends with an incline or an uphill. So you mentioned also that the hill sprint's something that you see a lot of more professional marathoners do. Do you think that doing hill work, if so, what kind of hill work is beneficial to when you're going to be running a course with hills?
Hill sprints will help, but I think probably what's more beneficial is by doing some of your long efforts and your long runs on really hilly courses, so that you can do them on tired legs. Now, the hills in the race that you're doing are in the start, so that doesn't necessarily matter that much because you will have somewhat fresh legs. But either way, I do think that doing a lot of hills on your easy to medium runs is very useful. I mean, I don't think you necessarily need to be doing really, really fast stuff on the hills, but as the race gets closer, we will do some workouts probably through the middle of the week where we're doing some tempo threshold stuff on a hilly route. So I'll say, can you try and pick the hilliest route you possibly can? Obviously, pace will go out the window, but we'll do quite a few efforts on these hills so you can really prepare to be able to run fast up and down them. It's pretty much that simple in my mind. I think hill sprints will help a little bit, but that's a little bit different. That's more just sort of try to exercise the anaerobic capacity and trying to make sure that muscle recruitment within the hamstrings and the calves is there. So that's something slightly different, but it also would help. But I do think that the two things are adding it into your long runs, especially the runs that I prescribe, which are probably 3 or 4 times in the last 10 weeks, where we'll do maybe 2.5 hours. There are, more or less somewhere between 20 and 23 miles where it'll be sort of steady, medium to steady pace. Adding a lot of hills into those runs for sure. And the second one is the interval sessions in the middle of the week. Maybe every second one would be include quite a few hills as well. So we'll definitely be incorporating them now. But I think that that stimulus is ideally done relatively close to the race, like within 8 weeks. There's not you could say there is a bit of a point to doing them before that, but there's not a lot of point in doing lots of hills 12 weeks out and then stopping doing them leading in. Like, you want that muscle stimulus to be there when the race gets closer.
Well, fortunately for us also, I do live in the Texas Hill Country, so they're not very hard to find. It's actually more difficult to find something flatter than it is to find the hills. All right, so my wife needs to get back into this office. She's working from home today, so I just have a couple more questions to finish up. How much did Floberg pay you to pace him at the Boston Marathon, and can you work with my budget?
He didn't pay me anything. I don't think I would ever take money from someone to pace, honestly. I love pacing people. I really find it meaningful to help people run a good time. I really do. So nothing. And I'd be happy to pace you. As long as it's not going to cost me a whole lot of money to get there and everything, if I can figure that out, I'd be more than happy to help people if it sort of suits what I'm doing in training as well. So
sweet. And then lastly, are you taking on any new runners, or are you full right now?
I have the ability to take on 2 more at the moment. One lady that was joining me, unfortunately, she has an Achilles problem that she just can't shake, so she's not going to start. And then one runner's about to take a little bit of time off because they've just had a new family member enter the scene. So I do have 2 spots available now, but I'm not actively promoting. I've got a lot of stuff to do at the moment with my own content, and I'm very happy with the people that I do coach. But there is 2 spots open if anyone's interested, but I'm not too phased about filling them immediately.
Now, also, I usually say, like, how can people find you? But instead, like, how can people support you?
I think if they really want to, just following along on YouTube and Instagram and Strava are helpful. But if you actually want to really support and actually get something in return, me and Luke, the guy I referenced before, we do a podcast every week on Wednesdays. They're actually recording in an hour and a half from now at 2:30, where we talk for an hour about our training week, and we put it on a private podcast feed, which is for supporters only. It's $10 a month or $99 a year. But so not only do you support financially the business, you actually get another podcast stream, so you actually get more content as well. So that's one thing, but that's only if you really want to support and really want to learn more about the training. But otherwise, just following along. I post everything on Strava and YouTube and Instagram to some extent, but I'm not. Sometimes I go for a week without even looking at Instagram and just delete it for a while because it's so addictive. But YouTube and Strava for sure.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this conversation on marathon training.
Yeah, anytime. I'm really looking forward to these next 8 weeks leading into the marathon, and yeah, maybe we can do another one afterwards. Just let me know.
Yeah, and then we'll touch on Kaizen at that point. Also, we'll test the accuracy
Yeah,
from
sure.
our marathons.
Absolutely.
All right, man.
Thanks, Andrew.
Take care.
Good chat.